Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Florida Amazing 10. As you see from the title of today's video, I'll be looking at the rather short-lived attraction Splendid China. While it only operated for a little over 10 years, it stands out as one of Florida's tourism's most curious and surprising stories. Located near the southwestern corner of the vast Walt Disney World property in Osceola County, the attraction featured over 60 Chinese replicas and exhibits. The replicas were scale models of architecture, monumental sculptures, and remarkable natural features. Charming park. I visited it several times in the first few years, even though its political and social positions weren't good. There's been times when I've chosen to visit attractions even though I felt they weren't places that deserved my money. Happily, those places are few and far between, but I still feel it's vital to visit them. All attractions seek to avoid political issues. It's not good for business. The major theme parks struggle with this. It's inevitable that issues such as noise, land use, labor, accidents, and waste management will draw the attention of local residents for good or bad. Companies such as Disney and Universal weather these small storms well enough, but Splendid China was a completely different matter. I'm going to look at Splendid China by covering 10 amazing facts about the park and provide an insight as to why the attraction operated for only a decade. Before I get into this compelling subject, I want to mention two things. Firstly, I want to thank my subscribers. The channel just passed 500 subscriptions and I really appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I hope you will. I've got over 80 videos on Florida's tourism history. Secondly, I want to tell you that the images I'm showing here come from the archive in several brochures, postcards, and booklets, all collected by me on visits to the park. Sadly, I didn't have a camera with me, especially since the quality of the printing of the collected documents is uneven and of limited quality. You can see with this set of giant panda postcards that I also bought in the gift shop, some of the photos are even out of focus. So it goes. Even limited, they do illustrate the sights and people that filled this unusual attraction. Amazing Splendid China fact number 1. Like the Magic Kingdom, Splendid China was largely a copy of another attraction. In 1993, the initial chairman of Splendid China, Ma Chi-man, wrote, "In 1989, my colleagues and I created Splendid China Miniature Scenic Spot in Shenzhen, China. The miniature replicas displayed within showcase China's most scenic landmarks and historical sites. The attraction has been an overwhelming success during its 4 years of operation. At Florida Splendid China, we have capitalized on the experiences of building our Shenzhen attraction. In Florida, we bring China to life, tell the story of the Chinese people, and provide Americans and international visitors a compelling new reason to visit Central Florida." That original park, situated just a few miles from the border with Hong Kong in southern China, is located in an area with other parks and attractions, much like Florida's Splendid China was. It's even just a couple miles from Shenzhen Happy Valley Amusement Park, which is filled with roller coasters and other exciting rides. Clearly, the developers, the China Travel Service, which is the tourism and travel agency of the government of China, wanted to place the park in an area ripe for tourism. By the way, I was lucky enough to get a souvenir book about Shenzhen Splendid China. It covers the Chinese park in quite a bit more depth than the souvenir booklet I bought at Florida's Splendid China. It's double the length and includes a great deal more text as well as nearly twice as many photos. Sadly, the quality of the printing isn't much better. In the early 1960s, when it was clear that Disneyland was a runaway success, yet very few people from east of the Mississippi were visiting, Walt Disney knew that a Disneyland East would be a good idea. Eventually, Central Florida was chosen for the location. See this video for that story. And Walt Disney World was built. Along with a couple hotels, the first thing built was the Magic Kingdom, essentially a copy of Disneyland. Most of the rides were the same, the layout was nearly identical, and the lands were identical, save one. Splendid China, built merely 10 miles from the Magic Kingdom, was also a copy of its parent park. It's smaller in size than the Shenzhen version, but its displays are largely the same as is the general layout. Both parks are described by Ma Chi-man as the crystallization of collective wisdom as well as the embodiment of collective willpower, perseverance, and the spirit of cooperation. Splendid China is a concentrated look at the country's nature and cultural history, at least the parts that were chosen by the Chinese Communist Party that controls the People's Republic of China. Then again, Disney's Epcot presents 11 pavilions that are mostly Eurocentric, with Morocco the single African country, Mexico the only representative of South and Central America, and Oceania not represented at all. Speaking of Epcot, here's a fun fact. Shenzhen Splendid China has a movie. Not just any movie. Described as a 360-degree giant screen cinema, which is one of the most modern cinemas in the world. It is composed of 9 projectors showing the movie synchronously in coordination with the effect of an all-around stereo hi-fi set. Now, if you visited the China Pavilion in Epcot, you should be aware that it has a similar movie. As Disney writes, "Behold the wonders of China." It's a Circle Vision 360 motion picture with many extraordinary scenes. The camera films from the center of a circle so that when the movie is shown, the 360-degree screen and digital sound will give the audience a remarkable experience. Amazing Splendid China fact number 2. The replicas in the park cover nearly 2,400 years of human creation. Of the structures at the park, there's a broad range of dates of creation. While the Great Wall has its origins in defensive walls constructed as early as 771 BCE, the various parts were first connected during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, between 221 and 210 BCE. Built of rammed earth, most of the ancient walls eroded away over the centuries, and very few sections remain today. I'll discuss the Great Wall a little later. We then turn to the Temple of Confucius in Khufu. Confucius, or Kong-Fu-Shi in Mandarin, was born around 551 BCE and died in 479. Within 2 years of his death, his former house was consecrated as a temple. Thus were given 478 BCE as the initial date. The temple is one of the largest temple complexes in China, as Confucius's philosophical teachings have never diminished. It covers nearly 4 acres or 1.6 hectares. The original house was removed from the temple in 611, plus the complex was destroyed by fire several times and each time rebuilt and sometimes expanded. The current temple complex dates from a 1703 restoration. Sadly, many of the sculptures were damaged and destroyed during the Communist Cultural Revolution of 1966. Going back to Emperor Qin, the next oldest display at Splendid China was the Terracotta Army. These remarkable sculptures date to Qin's death in 210 BCE, but they were only rediscovered in 1974. Located near Xi'an City in central China, 7 people were digging a well and happened upon part of the large number of ancient figures. As of 2007, it's believed that there are more than 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots with 520 horses, and 150 cavalry horses within the massive necropolis. By the way, Epcot also has a display of these extraordinary figures in case you wish to see them today. Moving forward in time, we can look at the Feihong Pagoda, also known as the Flying Rainbow Pagoda. Located in the Guangshen Temple in Linfen City, it's the largest and best preserved glazed Chinese pagoda, and it's part of a Buddhist complex built in 147 CE. Over the centuries, it had multiple reconstructions, and the current structure mostly dates from the 500s. It's 154 feet or 47 meters tall, and the glazed tiles on the exterior are highly detailed. Then there's the Forbidden City. Completed in 1420, the Imperial Palace in Beijing officially contains 8,886 rooms, though both Splendid China's claim nearly 10,000. For 24 emperors and half a millennium, this was their home and office, with 980 buildings sprawling out over 178 acres or 72 hectares. Amazing Splendid China fact number 3. The micro-sized Great Wall was a macro-sized model. While the Great Wall has its origins in defensive walls constructed as early as 771, the parts recreated at Splendid China date from a much later period of China's history. Experts haven't been able to agree as to what constitutes the Great Wall. Splendid China used the figure 4,200 miles, or 6,700 kilometers, for its length during First Emperor Qin's reign. Today, the Ming Dynasty Wall, which was built between 1368 and 1644, is the part most people think of when they picture the massive construction, and is about 5,500 miles or 8,800 kilometers in length. This part of the wall is what's displayed at Splendid China. Overall, the entirety of the remaining Great Wall is more than 13,000 miles or 21,000 kilometers. But as you can see from this map, it's made up of several sections. Splendid China's Great Wall is pretty impressive, too. It stretched nearly a half mile or 8/10 of a kilometer. Built at a scale of 1 to 10, it was comprised of 6.5 million bricks, each of them the size of a domino, which, by the way, the Chinese invented in the 1200s or earlier. Splendid China stated that the bricks were made in Beijing and exported to Florida. They were installed brick by Chinese artisans. The artisans could only lay an area of 5 square feet or half a square meter each day. It took a total of 7 months to complete. Considering its size and construction, it was probably the largest small-scale attraction in all of Florida. Amazing Splendid China fact number 4. Some of the replicas were so large, visitors could walk in them. As remarkable as was the size of the Great Wall, it was still too small to be walked on by tourists. However, there were other replicas that were large enough to support visitors. Among these were the Forbidden City, the Tomb of the Terracotta Warriors, and the Temple of Heaven. The site of Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum was particularly large. Still, it appears that walking through and on the displays is much more common at the Shenzhen Splendid China. It's also easy to forget that some of the displays were life-size. The Suzhou Garden, for example. It was a reproduction of a street scene from 1200 CE in the Venice of the East. Or as the narrator in Epcot's Wonders of China movie suggests, maybe Venice could be called the Suzhou of the West. There was an interesting balance between miniatures, life-size sections, and even parts that looked monumental, but in reality weren't. The Yongyang Grotto area is one such place. In the park it rises to 20 feet or 6 meters tall, but the original, located near the city of Datong, is some 60 feet or 18 meters tall. This monumental sculpture is actually part of a much larger site carved into a sandstone cliff from about 450 to 525 CE. Then there's the Leshan Buddha. While the replica in the park is an impressive 30 feet or 9 meters in height, the original that lies at the confluence of the Min and Dadu rivers in the southern part of Sichuan province rises 233 feet or 71 meters. The statue depicts a seated Buddha with his hands resting on his knees. The shoulders are 92 feet or 28 meters wide. Initially begun by a Buddhist monk named Hai Tong in 723 CE, it was completed by his disciples in 803. The entire statue was carved in the red sandstone, except for the ears that were designed in wood and covered with clay. Amazing Splendid China fact number 5. The grounds are substantially a giant bonsai forest. And yes, I realize that the art of bonsai is from Japan, but many of the techniques and even the name originally comes from China. Known as penzai, it's named after an ancient earthenware shallow dish called a pen. The art of penzai is thought to have begun more than 1400 years ago, and it appears the Japanese visitors to China borrowed the art form soon after. Splendid China did a terrific job of sizing the vegetation in the park to make it work with the displays that were depicted in various scales from 1 to 15 up to 1 to 3, as well as some that were life-sized. Splendid China's gardeners would shape bushes to resemble trees and keep some trees small enough through careful pruning, all the while picking colorful and interesting specimens to place in parts of the park that didn't require scaled sizes. The images I'm showing illustrate how effective the design and implementation were. Amazing Splendid China fact number 6. The park's construction integrated the modern skills of American builders and the traditional crafts of Chinese builders. Once again, to quote Mai Chi-man, chairman of Splendid China, "The building of Florida Splendid China exemplifies Sino-U.S. economic and technical cooperation and our abilities to productively interact with one another. The park is the child of Chinese and American contractors who have worked hard hand in hand." Construction of the largest Chinese tourist promotion project of its kind in the U.S. began at the end of 1991. American builders worked closely with 120 Chinese artisans. Most of the replicas in the park were prefabricated in China with the same materials as the objects in Shenzhen. They were shipped in 300 containers weighing 6,000 U.S. tons. Traditional Chinese architectural characteristics were presented using techniques that were, in some instances, hundreds of years old. The Chinese artisans began work in the morning, continuing until lunch at noon, then a nap at 2:30, and back to work until about 7. While the Americans initially thought this was rather strange, they were impressed with the results. The Chinese workers lived in an on-site trailer park, had their own chefs, and were provided with annual passes and frequent trips to Walt Disney World parks. It'd be interesting to hear their opinions on the Chinese replicas there. For replicas such as the Stone Forest and Longmen Grottos, American technology in the form of reinforced cable cages with shotcrete structural coating, the same process that's been used in the construction for each of Florida's theme parks, was enhanced by Chinese molding methods. Skilled workers from both countries labored side by side for 2 years, sometimes coming up with novel ways to approach the construction as they were building the replicas. While most of the American workers were used to working in Florida's heat and humidity, Splendid China admitted that many of their workers struggled with the difficult conditions. Amazing Splendid China fact number 7. Dr. Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum represents a life that is celebrated by both mainland China and Taiwan. I hesitate to compare Dr. Sun Yat-sen with George Washington, but there are some noticeable similarities. Sun Yat-sen is a singular individual in modern Chinese history for both the Republic of China and the People's Republic. While both nations have had completely opposite ideals for the past 70-plus years, they agree that Sun played a critical role in the history of both governments, because he took down dynastic rule in China, paving the way for the two governments to come into existence. As a result, people in China regard him as the father of the nation, just like Americans regard George Washington as the leader of the Founding Fathers. Washington and Sun hated the way their respective governments functioned. Sun believed that the Qing dynasty did not have its people's best interest at heart, and Washington believed that Britain was oppressive and should give the colonists the freedom they deserved. Both men organized fighting groups and led them in the battle in an effort to overthrow the government. Those wars succeeded, and afterwards they became leaders in the political realm. While both became first presidents of their new nations, Sun was actually a provisional president, they chose to peaceably turn over their role. Washington after 2 terms, or 8 years, and Sun after only a few months. Their leadership was marked by valuing the people rather than securing personal gain. Sun's impressive mausoleum was begun just 2 years after his death. Finished in 1929, it remains one of the most popular places for the Chinese to visit. Notably, when individuals from the Republic of China visit the mainland for diplomatic efforts, they regularly visit the mausoleum as well. Sun Yat-sen is unique among 20th century Chinese leaders. His unassailable reputation both in mainland China and in Taiwan is equal to George Washington, Simon Bolivar, and Mahatma Gandhi. All of them are referred to by the honorific Father of the Nation. Amazing Splendid China fact number 8. The park was owned by the Chinese government. Florida's Splendid China was developed as a 50-50 joint venture between Josephine and Frank Chen and the China Travel Service, or CTS. Josephine had emigrated to the U.S. in 1968 and in 1986 was able to purchase the land on U.S. Route 192 where Splendid China would be built. The Chens provided the land and management services, while CTS supplied construction materials, architects, and personnel. George Chen, the son of the Chens, would oversee the project. The total investment would be $100 million. Earlier I mentioned that CTS was the tourism and travel agency of the government of the People's Republic of China. CTS was the developer and owner of Shenzhen's Splendid China and was ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, which has ruled China since 1949. That's the same year CTS was founded and was tasked with marketing China to the world. The grand opening for Splendid China was December 18, 1993. Less than a month later, on January 15, 1994, it was announced that the Chens had sold their 50% interest in the park to CTS. The price was only $26 million. The surprising announcement cited philosophical differences over how to run the attraction. Later, George Chen would say that he was frustrated by the overwhelming amount of bureaucracy from China. When Splendid China opened, the leaders of China were certainly paying attention. It was an interesting time to have created such a project and was a risky venture, as China's popularity on the world stage was at its lowest in more than 20 years. While China was opening up to the West and was even relaxing control over its citizens, a dreadful event occurred in Beijing. Known as the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, the 1989 events stemmed from the Chinese people's anxieties that the reforms of the 80s would continue after the death of pro-reform Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang in April. Only a few days later, about 1 million people assembled in Tiananmen Square, located in front of the Forbidden City. In the West, the protests were particularly interesting in that the world news agencies had been invited, quite coincidentally, to set up in the square due to Mikhail Gorbachev's visit for a first major Sino-Soviet summit in 30 years. China hoped it would be a public relations coup, viewed live by people all over the world. Instead, the news agencies covered the protesters, who made allusions to the freedom enjoyed in most Western nations, going so far as to make a goddess of democracy statue, which looked quite a lot like the Statue of Liberty. The protests continued through Soviet General Secretary's visit. Americans were able to watch the events unfold live on CNN, which at the time was the only 24-hour TV news channel. As I write this, I've seen that CNN anchor Bernard Shaw has died. I still remember his voice narrating these events in China. Shaw was presented an Emmy for anchoring the single most outstanding news event of 1989.
I'll never forget how he was that calm voice, sort of almost doing play-by-play, as the Chinese authorities cut CNN's coverage during the Tiananmen Square standoff.
I'm being told that the government officials are coming into the CNN control room.
Near the end of May, martial law was declared and the state mobilized 250,000 army soldiers. By June 5th, after repeated attempts to move into the center of the city and clear Tiananmen Square, troops moved in and within about 6 hours secured the square. Estimates of the death toll vary from several hundred to several thousand, with thousands more wounded. The still, as yet unidentified, Tank Man stared down the row of tanks barely 6 hours after the massacre. His fate is unknown to this day. The souvenir booklet for Splendid China was originally produced for the grand opening of the park, but little in the contents changed with the addition in the archive. At the front of both editions are a series of congratulatory messages from various Chinese officials. These include Jiang Zemin, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party who rose to power as the direct beneficiary of the political aftermath of Tiananmen. Li Peng, Premier of the People's Republic of China. Li was the most visible representative of government who backed the use of force to quell the Tiananmen protests. Li used his authority to declare martial law and ordered the military crackdown, which led to the massacre. His involvement led to him being known as the Butcher of Beijing. Yang Shangkun, President of the People's Republic of China, who played a leading role in crushing the Tiananmen protests and was actually the one who planned and supervised the operations to clear the square and surrounding streets. Interestingly, the well-wishers also included a former U.S. president. Some 20 years prior to the opening of Splendid China, Richard Nixon was instrumental in bringing China out into the world stage after so many years of self-imposed isolation. Amazing Splendid China fact number 9. Artists and performers at Splendid China originally came from China. An early park brochure shares the following. Throughout the park you will be entertained by authentic Chinese acrobats and artists. The entertainment is live and spectacular, often combining beauty and strength. Martial arts demonstrations combine almost mystical powers with ballet-like moves. Mongolian wrestling is featured along with Chinese dancers and other traditional performers. Just like the Chinese workers who built the attraction along with their American counterparts, the artists, craftspeople, and athletes who worked at the park were brought from China. There's no question this added a wonderful and resonant element to the overall experience. In the first few years, there were many shows in the amphitheater as well as throughout the park. There were calligraphers, paper artists, and embroiderers. There were performances from individuals who represented the several ethnic minorities in China as well. Terrific music, lovely dances, and wild acrobatics. However, there was an issue that grew up several years after the park opened. It was alleged by some of the 160 Chinese staff that their activities and the ability to move around after work were regulated. Initially, these allegations were anonymously provided to the Central Florida Future, the newspaper of the University of Central Florida. The staff all lived in the company-owned Days Inn, and it was argued that the housing situation was based on Splendid China's fear that employees would defect and apply for political asylum. In 1998, it's thought that several of the staff were able to leave and secured asylum. Another newspaper reported that as many as 42 employees had escaped from the park. The information wasn't made officially public either by Splendid China or by the U.S. government, so we don't really know what happened. Unfortunately, it's speculation, but it was reported by several news organizations. Years after, others have suggested that Splendid China began hiring Americans to replace the original staff. It's hard to see that as true because by 1998 the park was struggling with attendance and was known to have been losing a lot of money. One piece of evidence of this is that they began reducing the number of staff. By 2000, the numbers were reduced from 160 to 90, and by the time the park closed, there was merely a skeleton crew of 40, half of which were performers who returned to China. Amazing Splendid China fact number 10. Did protests cause the attraction to close? The park lasted only 10 years, a remarkably short time for a $100 million investment. While there's no question that there was many reasons that contributed to the downfall, unfortunately this video is too long already to seriously discuss each of them. So I just wanted to cover the most remarkable issue the park had, that of protests. Now, if you pay attention to the news, you'll know that some of Florida's attractions are quite used to protests, but really, Splendid China was the champion. The first protest occurred on December 19th, the day after the park opened. That morning, several Buddhist monks demonstrated outside the park. I'd suggest it's bad when you have monks protesting a tourist attraction. They held signs, including one that stated, "End Chinese genocide in Tibet," On that day, 4 monks paid admission into the park and walked to the replica of Tibet's Potala Palace, where they stood in silent prayer, weeping. The monks became an attraction themselves, as there were many reporters and photographers on the park's first day open to the general public. The site where they stood was easily the most alienating replica in the park. Splendid China says the Tibetan complex dates back to 641 CE, and that would be a reference to the earlier fortress called the White or Red Palace, built on the site by Songtsen Gampo, who became the first emperor of Tibet. The Potala Palace was built between 1645 and 1694 by the 5th Dalai Lama and incorporated elements of the old fortress. While it was still under construction, it became the winter palace for the Buddhist spiritual leaders, the Dalai Lamas. An immense religious and administrative complex in Lhasa, the Potala Palace was the seat of the Gelung, or Yellow Hat school of Tibetan Buddhism. Yellow hat referring to the yellow peach-shaped hats the Gelung monks wore. It remained the winter palace of the Tibetan leaders until the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, a serious attempt to remove the Chinese People's Liberation Army, which had taken over Tibet a few years earlier. It was at this time that the current Dalai Lama and some of his community fled to India to set up a Tibetan government in exile. At the same time, thousands of Tibetan monks were executed or arrested, and monasteries and temples around the city were looted or destroyed. There has been continued unrest in Chinese-controlled Tibet ever since. The long-term issues with Tibet were the subject of other protests over the years, but they were hardly the only ones. There were demonstrations referencing tensions between ethnic Mongolians who lived in Chinese-held Inner Mongolia, which was also represented at Splendid China. Then there were the issues with the park's treatment of their staff and general issues with China and its communist political ideology. Human rights groups charged that the park presented a false picture of social harmony and contentment that China suggested could be found among the country's ethnic and religious minorities. Some of those minorities argue that their relationship with the government is far from harmonious. Sadly, it's likely that Florida's Splendid China was doomed from the very beginning. Despite the terrific attention to detail in the construction and the talents of the builders, artisans, and other staff, there were several significant issues that plagued the operation of the park that it would take numerous radical modifications to have ever succeeded. Indeed, it was only the willingness of CTS to keep pouring money into it that kept it in operation. While the Shenzhen Park was a success and continues to operate 33 years after it was built, the developers of the Florida venture never researched if such a park would succeed in the U.S. and especially in the Orlando tourist market. By the time it opened, Disney had 3 theme parks, Universal Studios had opened, SeaWorld remained popular, Busch Gardens was developing into yet another ride-focused theme park, and there were many smaller attractions such as water parks and dramatic dinner shows. The market was not only extremely competitive, it was arguably saturated with attractions. Splendid China's garden-like, passive, and relaxing experience didn't draw the attendance it needed to make a profit. Since Disney World opened, Central Florida tourism has been all about adventure, and viewing historical miniatures, as impressive as they were, paled in comparison to being able to walk through life-size castles, palaces, forts, urban street scenes, jungles, pyramids, and dinosaur encounters. Combine that with poor management and continuing protests, and it would seem that it was inevitable that Splendid China would fail. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button and then subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.